Welcome to the show. I want to talk about Father Emil Kapaun today in light of the recent discovery of his mortal remains. Who is Father Emil Kapaun, and why should you care? This episode of the show involves no guest, just me doing a rant of honor and veneration to this amazing American patriot, Catholic priest, and candidate for sainthood on the Patrick Coffin Show. This episode brought to you by MyPillow.com. I am a proud supporter of Mike Lindell. I've interviewed the man 3 times. I love his products. MyPillow lives up to all the promises on the commercials you've probably seen many, many times. I just got a pair of slippers, and from the first moment I put them on after a long, tiring day, they were like your favorite college sweater, but for your feet. Firm, supportive, amazing. They have sheets, they have bathrobes. Mostly, though, they have pillows. So go to MyPillow.com. My name, Patrick, gets you a Patrick Coffin Show discount. And that's up to 66% off. Just check out the website. It's amazing. And proud to support and to throw traffic at MyPillow.com. Again, my name, Patrick, as a coupon at the checkout, gets you a big old discount. Coming up next, my rant on Father Emil Kapaun, servant of God, soon to be venerable, God willing. Okay, let's get into Father Emil Kapaun. He is a candidate for sainthood. He's servant of God right now. He is not as well known as he should be, and I think that's going to change now that the Department of Defense announced that they had found his mortal remains 70 years after he died. Father Capon is one of the over a dozen candidates for U.S.-born male saints. There are no United States, meaning born on U.S. soil, males who are saints. We have 3 females who were born here. That would be, the first one was canonized in 1975 by Paul VI. Her name is St. Elizabeth Ann Seton. We have Blessed now St. Mother Catherine Drexel of Philadelphia, and St. Kateri Tekakwitha. These are all born on American soil. Now, some people say, well, wait a second, Patrick, we have American saints. What about St. Damien? Lived so many years in Molokai in Hawaii. Well, he doesn't count because he was Belgian. He was born in Belgium, and I believe his shrine or his tomb is there back in Belgium. St. John Neumann, the first Archbishop of, I think he was the first, of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, was actually from Bohemia, and Father Junipero Serra, the great saint of the California missions, was a Spaniard. It's always interesting to talk to people about the martyrs. Now, in Canada, the martyrs I'm referring to are called the Canadian martyrs. There are many parishes across Canada devoted to the Canadian martyrs. That would be Jean de Brébeuf, St. Isaac Jogues, St. René Goupil and companions. They were martyred for their troubles in evangelizing and helping culturalize the Huron Indians, all martyred. There are American parishes where they're called the American Martyrs because they spent some time in New York State. And then there's some parishes that are called the North American Martyrs parishes. So they're neither Canadian nor American nor North American. They are, in fact, French. So here's a short list just off the top of my head of candidates for the priesthood, and I want to end with Father Emil Kapaun. We have 3 blesseds. Blessed Father Solanus Casey, the great Capuchin, died in 1957. We have Blessed Stanley Rother, who was murdered in Guatemala in 1981. He was from Olathe, Oklahoma. And am I getting that name right? Okarche? Olathe? Please forgive. Anyway, Father Stanley Rother, R-O-T-H-E-R. And Blessed Michael McGivney, the founder of the Knights of Columbus. That's it, 3 blesseds. The other ones are either servants of God or venerable. So in no particular order, these are the ones that I can recall. Father Nelson Baker, who worked with homeless youth in northern Ohio and New York. Father Walter Cizek, the Pennsylvania-born Jesuit who was incarcerated for 23 years in Soviet gulags, who came back in 1963. An amazing story. He wrote a book I've recommended over and over and over again called He Leadeth Me, which is a short distilled version of another account called With God in Russia. So that's Father Walter Cizek, S.J., The former Cardinal Archbishop of New York, Cardinal Terence Cook, Father Augustus Tolton, the first Black American Catholic priest, Father Vincent Capodanno, the grunt padre from the Vietnam War, who was killed in action there in 1967, Father Isaac Hecker, Father John Hardin, the great catechist, Father Patrick Peyton, he who, the family who prays together, stays together, fame, Brother William Gagnon, Thomas Price, who's the founder of the Maryknolls. I don't think that's going anywhere since the Maryknolls are now completely communistic. There's a seminarian named Francis Parater who died in Rome in 1920. Interesting story. Bernard J. Quinn, and Father Emil Kapaun. Father Capon was born in Pilsen, Kansas in 1916. He was classic all-American Kansas farm boy. Grew up in dirt poverty in the Depression. Czech background. Knew from an early time in his life that he wanted to be a priest. He had some good mentors in Pilsen. And he got himself ordained and was immediately drawn to help the military. So after he was named pastor as a young priest, he requested permission from his bishop to join the U.S. military effort in the Burma Theater during World War II, which he did. And he recorded some homilies for troops. I think it was called Voices of America in Japan, in Tokyo. And I'm going to put a link in the show notes here. If you're listening, it's patrickcoffin.media. You can hear Father Capon's voice. You can hear his rough-hewn, direct way of speaking, kind of homely, blunt, simple, to-the-point homilies. Great lessons for priests and pastors today who are preaching. You can learn a lot from Father Capon and how he distilled the gospel into very practical nuggets. So World War II is over in 1945, and the Korean conflict breaks out in 1950. And although he had driven for years on end, 2,000 miles per month in rickety old Jeeps from station to station, troop to troop, he signed back up as a chaplain with the U.S. Army and was sent to North Korea. Well, he was sent to Korea. They were fighting the North Koreans, but he eventually ended up in North Korea because he was captured and had a chance to escape. This happened twice, but he decided to stay with his men, especially the wounded. Before I go any further into Father Capon's life and his heroism in the POW camp, I want to mention something that's really the linchpin or the springboard for the American public to learn about Father Capon's heroism and his priesthood. And that springboard was a 1954 essay in Saturday Evening Post. Remember that? The Saturday Evening Post featured an essay by a man that I had the privilege of interviewing. He was then Lieutenant Mike Dow, also called Ray Michael Dow. And he was in the camp with Father. He knew him well. And I just want to read this to you. It's very moving. It's very simply written. And I want to share it with you because this is the media splash that was the occasion of Father Capon being introduced to the American public. Now, there's some controversy about it. The name pronunciation, it's a Czech name, which is pronounced Capon. I believe many of his family members call it Capon. Cardinal Spellman, when he was turning over the soil with a shovel at a high school built in his honor in Wichita, pronounced it Capon, and it kind of stuck. So depending on who you talk to, it's Capon or Capon. I'm going to go with Capon, which is the pronunciation the president gave, President Obama, when he issued the citation awarding Father Capon the Presidential Medal of Honor. So I'm going to go on the side of Capon. Capon is the German pronunciation. He was Czech. So with that, this is The Ordeal of Chaplain Father Capon by Mike Dow. He wore the cross of the chaplain branch instead of the crossed rifles of the infantry, but he was, I think, the best foot soldier I ever knew, and the bravest man, and the kindest. His name was Emil Joseph Kapaun, and he was a priest of the Roman Catholic Church. But the men he served in the prison camps of Korea didn't care whether he was Catholic or Baptist, Lutheran or Presbyterian. To all of them, Catholic, Protestant, and Jew alike, and to men who professed no formal faith at all, he was simply Father. And each of them, when trouble came, drew courage and hope and strength from him. He's dead now, murdered by the Red Chinese, and his body lies in an unmarked grave somewhere along the Yalu River. But hundreds of men who knew and loved him have not forgotten him. And I write this so that folks at home can know what kind of man he was, and what he did for us, and how he died. The first thing I want to make clear is this. He was a priest of the church and a man of great piety. But there was nothing ethereal about him, nothing soft or unctuous or holier than thou. He wore his piety on his heart. Outwardly, he was all GI, tough of body, rough of speech sometimes, full of the wry humor of the combat soldier. In a camp where men had to steal or starve, he was the most accomplished food thief of them all. There's a little reference here, on a gloss. This and other references to stealing are used loosely. As the Catholic Encyclopedia says, one in danger of death from want of food or suffering any form of extreme necessity may lawfully take from another as much as is required to meet his present distress, even though the possessor's opposition be entirely clear. Okay, end of gloss. In a prison whose inmates hated their communist captors with a bone-deep hate, he was the most unbending enemy of communism. And when they tried to brainwash him, he had the guts to tell them to their faces that they lied. He pitied the Reds for their delusions, but he preached no doctrine of turn the other cheek. I came upon him once sitting in the sunshine by the road. There was a smile on his face and a look of happiness in his eyes. I hated to break in on his meditations, but I needed cheering, so I asked him, "What are you thinking of, Father?" "Of that happy day," he said, "when the first American tank rolls down that road. Then I'm going to catch that little so-and-so comrade's son and kick his butt right over the compound fence." Unquote. He spoke in parallels. Such plain, blunt speech was typical of him. He always spoke in phrases that the most unlettered soldier could understand, for he was the son of a Kansas farmer, and he had a farmer's flair for down-to-earth, homely talk. In his religious services, which he doggedly held even though the Chinese threatened him, his brief sermons were deep, but every point he made struck home. Even the great mysteries of the Catholic faith, with which no man can fully comprehend, became clearer to us as he talked of them. He always spoke in parallels, relating the sufferings that Christ endured to those that we were forced to bear. As he spoke, the agony in the garden, the road to Calvary, the crucifixion, these became very real to us, who ourselves lived daily under the threat of death, and who bore our own crosses of blows and cold and illness and starvation. But Christ endured, he told us, and we too must endure, for the day of our resurrection from the tomb of the prison camp would surely come, as surely as the stone was rolled away from the sepulchre. Because of his sermons, which gave us hope and courage, and because of the food he stole for us and the care he gave us when we were sick, many of us came back who never would have survived our long ordeal without him. He had become a legend among the troops long before the Chinese captured him. When his outfit, the 8th Cavalry Regiment of the 1st Cavalry Division, was fighting along the Naktong River, his jeep was blown up by enemy fire and his driver was wounded. So he commandeered a ramshackle bicycle, helmet jammed down over his ears, pockets stuffed with apples and peaches he scrounged from Korean orchards. He'd ride this bone shaker over the rocky roads and the paths through the paddy fields until he came to the forward posts. There he'd drop in a shallow hole beside a nervous rifleman, crack a joke or two, hand him a peach, say a little prayer with him, and move on to the next hole. He always stayed close to the fighting. Even before the blood had dried on the dusty slopes after the Cav had taken a hill, he'd set up his altar on a litter stretched across 2 ammunition boxes. There on the battlefield, with mortar fire coming in and the enemy massing for a counterattack, he'd hear confessions and celebrate the Mass and administer Holy Communion to men who in another hour would be in battle again. His parish was the front, and the battalion aid station close behind the lines. There, he'd cheer and comfort the wounded all he could. He'd joke and kid with the lightly wounded, and over the dying men, whatever their faith, he'd say the last prayers of the church. He seemed to have no fear that he himself might be killed. At Kumchan early in the war, when word came back that there was a wounded man on the left flank of the 1st Battalion in a position so exposed that the litter men could not reach him, Father and another officer went after him and brought him back, crawling and ducking from rock to rock through fire so thick his pipe was shot out of his mouth. It was his devotion to the wounded which finally cost him his freedom and his life. It was at Unsan on the 2nd of November 1950. For 36 hours, the 8th Cavalry, fighting a perimeter defense, beat off a fanatical attack. Early in the morning, the breakthrough came, and all day hand-to-hand fighting swirled around the command post and the aid station where the wounded lay. Finally, at dusk, the order came for every man who could still walk to try a breakout through the surrounding enemy. Father, who was unwounded, might have escaped with them. He refused to go. Of his own free will, he stayed on, helping Captain Clarence L. Anderson, the regimental surgeon, take care of the wounded. And there, just at dark, the Chinese took him, as he said the last prayers over a dying man. I'll never forget the night I finally met him. It was at Pyeongtaung, on a backwater of the Yalu River, a village where prisoners from many American units were being assembled. With the survivors of my outfit, C Company of the 19th Infantry of the 24th Division, I had been brought there from near Anju, where we had been overrun. The men of the 89th Cavalry, who had broken out of the perimeter and had later been captured by 2s and 3s as they scattered to the south, were already there. As we came in, they crowded around us, asking for word of Father Capon. We had none. That afternoon, Pyeongtaung was bombed. A B-26 swept over, dropping firebombs, and more than half the city went up in flames. The Chinese panicked. They broke all the prisoners out of their houses and, shooting at the feet of the walking wounded to hurry them along, they herded us up onto a hill above the town. All that afternoon and into the night, we sat there on the icy slope, cold and miserable, smoking cigarettes made out of dried oak leaves and watching the burning town. That night, they brought us down to where the wounded from another group lay along a road on litters made out of straw sacks stretched on rough pine poles. We shouldered their stretchers and set off over a frozen road to the southwest. I was on the right-hand pole at the front. We carried them on our shoulders, and as the shoulders began to ache with the pressure of the pole against the muscle, we'd stop and change round. It was during one of these breaks that I noticed a man who was carrying behind me. He was a short man, thick-shouldered, with wide-set gray eyes and a strong jaw with a deep cleft in it. He wore a thin red-brown beard with a little tuft of goat whiskers at the chin. "I'm Mike Dow," I said. "Capon," he said, and put out his hand. "Father," I said, feeling as if I'd met an old friend. "I've heard about you." He smiled. "Don't pass it along. It might get back to the chief of chaplains." It was a feeble joke, but it cheered us all. Hour after hour, we stumbled on. It was hard enough to walk by yourself in the dark on that slippery footing, but carrying a litter was agony. Father never ordered a man to carry. After a rest, he'd just call, "Let's pick him up!" And all down the line, the guys would bend and lift and follow him. Far in the night, we came to a village of huts scattered along a narrow valley. The Chinese went ahead of us, driving the people out of their houses. We dropped off the wounded at one house, and then the rest of us were moved on to other houses further up the valley. Father and Dr. Anderson refused to leave the wounded, but the Chinese threatened them and made them move along with the rest of us. The next morning they came around and pulled all the officers out and put us together in a compound at the north end of the valley. Father squawked about being separated from the enlisted men, but the Chinese poked him with gun butts and made him move along. In the first week of our stay in the valley, the Chinese allowed us a food ration of about 500 grams, or 1 pound 2 ounces, of millet or cracked corn per man per day. It was a starvation ration to begin with, and they cut it down to 450 grams, slightly less than a pound. It was obvious, Father said, that we must either steal food or slowly starve. And in that dangerous enterprise, we must have the help of some power beyond ourselves. So, standing before us all, he said a prayer to St. Dismas, the good thief, who was crucified at the right hand of Jesus, asking for his aid. I'll never doubt the power of prayer again. Father, it seemed, could not fail. At the risk of being shot by the guards, He'd sneak at night into the little fields around the compound and prowl through the shocked corn and find where the Koreans had hidden potatoes and grain beneath the corn shocks. He moved out of the crowded room where 19 of us slept spoon fashion on the dirt floor to sleep in an open shed in the compound. And he found that the shed backed up a crib full of Korean corn, which he stole surreptitiously, ear by ear. His riskiest thefts were carried out by daylight under the noses of the Chinese. The POWs cooked their own food, which was drawn from an open supply shed some 2 miles down the valley. When men were called out to make the ration run, Father would slip in at the end of the line. Before the ration detail reached the supply shed, he'd slide off into the bushes. Creeping and crawling, he'd come up behind the shed, and while the rest of us started a row with the guards and the Chinese doling out the rations, he'd sneak in, snatch up a sack of cracked corn, and scurry off into the bushes with it. There were other men stealing too, and some of them squirreled their stolen food away to eat themselves. Father tossed his into the common pot. He never said a word to the men who hid and hoarded food. But at night, after a successful foray, he'd say a prayer of thanks to God for providing food, quote, which all can equally share, unquote. That seemed to shame them, and soon the private hoarding stopped. His one great failure had overtones of humor which served to relieve what at the moment was black tragedy. Once, after we had moved back to Pyeongtaung, a little black pig wandered into the compound. Men who had tasted no meat in months felt themselves drooling as Father, a big rock in his hand, cautiously stalked the pig. While a dozen silent prayers went up, he raised the stone high and brought it down. It struck the pig, but only at a glancing blow. The pig set up a horrible squealing. The Chinese guard came running, slamming a cartridge into his rifle and shouting, "Huh? Huh? Huh?" Father fled for the latrine, and the guard, confused, ran down the road in hot pursuit of the pig. Soon after we reached the valley, the wounded in the sick house, the Chinese called it the hospital, began to die by the dozens, poisoned by their untended wounds. Finally, the Chinese allowed Dr. Anderson to go to their aid, although he had nothing but the skill of his hands to help them. Encouraged by this concession, Father asked permission to go with the doctor. It was refused. "What these men need is medicine, not prayer," the Chinese told him. "Well, since they aren't getting any medicine, a little prayer won't hurt," Father would reply. "No," the Chinese said, "you will not be permitted to spread your poisonous Christian propaganda here." Then began Father's most hazardous exploits. On days when there was a ration run, he'd stop and steal food at the warehouse, and then with his pockets full of cracked corn or millet, dodging the Chinese roving patrols that watched the trail, he'd move on to the house where the wounded were. On days when there was no ration run or wood-carrying detail, he'd sneak down to the creek that ran through the valley, ducking under the bushes to keep out of sight of the guards along the road. He scrounged cotton undershirts to make bandages. He took their old bandages, foul with corruption, and sneaked them out and washed them and then sneaked them back again. He picked the lice from their bodies, an inestimable service, for a man so weak he can't pick his own lice soon will die. He let them smoke his pipe, loaded with dry cotton leaves, and he joked with them and said prayers for them and held them in his arms like children as delirium came over them. But the main thing he did for them was to put into their hearts the will to live. For when you're wounded and sick and starving, it's easy to give up and quietly die. Somehow, as it says in the New Testament, power went forth from him and healed them. In Father Capon's valley, the conditions were the same as in the camp known as Death Valley. But in Death Valley, the death rate was 10 times higher. Even when they died, he did not abandon them. The POWs buried their own dead, carrying the bodies up the adjacent mountainsides and later in Pyeongtaung across the frozen Yalu backwater to a little island where they dug the graves in the stony, frozen ground. Men dodged this detail whenever they could, but always Father volunteered. And at the grave, as the earth covered the naked body, for the clothing of the dead was saved to warm the living, he would utter for them the last great plea: "Eternal rest grant unto him, O Lord, and let perpetual light shine upon him." When he'd done all he could at the house of the wounded, he would slip out of the houses where the enlisted men were kept. He would step in quietly and quickly, saying, "The Lord be with you," and the starving, torpid men lying on the straw mats would sit up and respond as he taught them, "And with thy spirit." Then he would say a quick general service, beginning with a prayer for the men who had died in Korea, both in battle and in prison, and for the sick and wounded and for the folks back home. Then he would say a prayer of thanks to God for the favors he had granted us, whether we knew about them or not. Quote, "For the food and wood and water we have received at the hands of our enemies." Unquote. And then he'd speak, very briefly, a short, simple sermon, urging them to hold on and not lose hope of freedom. And above all, he urged them not to fall for the lying doctrines the Reds were trying to pound into our heads. "Be not afraid of them who kill the body," he'd say, quoting the scriptures. "Fear ye him whom, after he hath killed, hath power to cast into hell." To Father's stubborn faith, the man who bought the communist teachings, and a very small group did out of ignorance or opportunism, was selling his immortal soul. In his soiled and ragged fatigues, with his straggly beard and his odd-looking woolen cap made of the sleeve of an old GI sweater pulled down over his ears, he looked like any other half-starved prisoner. But there was something in his voice and bearing that was different. A dignity, a composure, a serenity that radiated from him like a light. Wherever he stood was holy ground, and the spirit within him, a spirit of reverence and abiding faith, went out to the silent, listening men and gave them hope and courage and a sense of peace. By his very presence, somehow, he could turn a stinking, louse-ridden mud hut for a little while into a cathedral. He did 1,000 things to keep us going. He gathered and washed the foul undergarments of the dead, distributed them to men so weak from dysentery that they couldn't move, and washed and tended these men as if they were little babies. He traded his watch for a blanket, cut it up to make warm socks for helpless men whose feet were freezing. All one day, in a freezing wind, with a sharp stick in his bare hands, he cut steps into the steep, ice-covered path that led down to the stream, so that the men carrying water would not fall. The most dreaded housekeeping chore of all was cleaning the latrines, and men argued bitterly over whose time it was to carry out this loathsome task. And while they'd argue, he'd slip out, quietly, and do the job. In mid-January, in sub-zero cold, they marched us 8 miles back to Pyeongtaung into houses still shattered by the bombing and the fire. 9 of the sick and wounded died that day, and many of us, sick, half-starved and despairing, were on the point of giving up. But Father led scrounging parties out to prowl through the ruins to find nails and tin and broken boards to patch the houses and make them livable. In the yard of the officer's compound, he built a little fireplace with bricks he had stolen. On it, with wood he had stolen. Once they caught him stealing pickets from the fence and made him stand for hours, stripped of his outer garments, in the bitter cold. He would heat water in pans made from tin he had stolen and pounded into the shape with a rock. Every morning he'd bring this pan full of hot water, calling cheerfully, "Coffee, everybody," and pour a little into every man's bowl. Although there was no coffee in it, somehow this sip of hot water in the morning gave each man heart to rise and pick off his lice and choke down his bowl of soupy millet, and face, if not with cheerfulness, at least without despair, another day of captivity and abuse. He was always telling us we'd soon be free, and he was always dreaming up fancy menus, 10-course meals we'd eat when we got home. At night we'd hear the roar and see the flash of great explosions to the south. It was our bombers, working over the roads and bridges on the Reds' supply routes to the front. But we thought it was our artillery. "The guns sound closer tonight," Father would say. "They're coming. They'll be here soon. The moon is full tonight. By the time it's full again, we'll be free." As weeks and months passed, robbed of all strength by pellagra and beriberi, men grew weaker. The unbroken diet of millet and corn became nauseating. We could hardly choke it down. By mid-March, we were in a desperate condition. Boiling green weeds in our hut for vitamins, the hideous swelling of the body that is the first mark of approaching death by starvation was showing up on more and more of us. The night before St. Patrick's Day, Father called us together and prayed to St. Patrick, asking him to help us in our misery. The next day, the Chinese brought us a case of liver, the first meat we had, and issued golian instead of millet. The liver was spoiled, and golian is sorghum seed used as cattle feed in the States, but to us they were like manna. Later he prayed for tobacco, and that night a guard walked by and tossed a little bag of straw-like Korean tobacco into our room. As our bodies weakened, the Reds stepped up the pace of their propaganda assault upon our minds. Hour after hour we sat in lectures while Comrade Sun, the fanatic little Chinese who hated Americans with insane hatred, assailed our rotten capitalistic Wall Street civilization. Then we'd have to comment upon the great truths revealed by Comrade Sun. A few bold men, in reckless despair, commented in unprintable words of contempt and were thrown into a freezing hole or subjected to other severe tortures, sometimes resulting in death. Some veiled their ridicule. According to the great doctrines taught us by the noble Stalin, Lenin, Marx, Engels, Amos, and Andy, they would read out aloud in the classes. Father was not openly arrogant, nor did he use subterfuge. Without losing his temper or raising his voice, he'd answer the lecturer, point by point, with a calm logic that set Comrade Sun screaming and leaping on the platform like an angry ape. Strangely, they never punished him, except by threats and ominous warnings. 2 officers who knew him well were taken away and tortured. With their hands tied behind them, they were lifted by ropes until their wrist joints pulled apart. Then they were brought back to accuse him publicly. They charged him with slandering the Chinese, which was true if you called the real truth slander, as they did. They said he advocated resistance to the Red Study program and that he displayed a hostile attitude toward all his captors, all of which was also true. They said he threatened men with court-martial on their return if they went along with the Chinese, which was not true. Father never threatened anybody. When the 2 men came back after their ordeal, unsure of their welcome, Father was the first to greet them. Looking at their twisted hands, he told them, "You should never have suffered a moment trying to protect me." We expected that the public accusation would bring on a farcical trial in which Father would be convicted and taken out and never return. Instead, they merely called him in and bullied him and threatened him. We realized then what we had half known all along. They were afraid of him. They recognized in him a strength they could not break, a spirit they could not quell. Above all things, they feared a mass rebellion, and they knew if the Father was maltreated, the whole camp of 4,000 men would mutiny. On Easter Sunday, 1951, he hurled at them his boldest challenge, openly flouting their law against religious services. In the yard of a burned-out church in the officers' compound, just at sunrise, he read the Easter service. He could not celebrate the Easter Mass, for all his Mass equipment had been lost at the time of his capture. All he had was the things he used when administering the last rites to the dying. The purple ribbon called a stole, which he wore around his neck as a badge of his priesthood. The gold pyx, now empty, in which the host had been carried when he administered Holy Communion, and the little bottles of holy oil used to administer the last sacraments. But he fashioned a cross out of 2 rough pieces of wood, and from a borrowed missal, he read the Stations of the Cross to the scarecrow men, sitting on the rubbled steps of the burned church. He told the story of Christ's suffering and death, and then, holding in his hands a rosary made of bent barbed wire cut from a prison fence, he recited the glorious mysteries of Christ risen from the tomb and ascended into heaven. As we watched him, it was clear to us that Father himself, at last, had begun to fail in strength. On the starvation diet we were allowed, a man could not miss a single day's meal without growing too weak to walk, and for months, Father had been sharing his meager rations with sick and dying men. The week after Easter, he began to limp, hobbling along on a crooked stick. The next Sunday, as he read the service for the first Sunday after Easter, As he reached the line in the epistle, "And this is the victory that overcomes the world, our faith," his voice faltered, and we caught him as he fell. Beneath his tattered uniform, his right leg was dreadfully swollen and discolored. For weeks, we all knew, he'd been suffering terrible bone aches, a byproduct of hunger that came upon men at night with such fearful pain that they would scream and beat the ground in agony. Father, when awake, had never whimpered, though tears of pain filled his eyes. When he slept, though, his iron will broke, and he would moan pitifully. Finally, the bad pain went away, but the leg continued to swell until it was one great mass of purple, blue, and yellow flesh. The communist, quote, doctor, a brainwasher posing as a medical man, pronounced the usual diagnosis by which they sought to convince us, or themselves, that we were an evil, immoral, and decaying race. Father, he said blandly, had syphilis. Dr. Anderson and his medical companion, Captain Sidney Eisenstein, knew it for what it was, a blood clot blocking circulation to the leg. They applied hot packs, and slowly the swelling began to subside. Soon Father could walk again, although he was too weak and shaky, he would often fall. Then a fearful dysentery seized him, and as he so often had done for us, we cared for him as best we could. And he beat that and got on his feet again. Then one raw, cold day he arose, a walking ghost, to give the last sacrament to a dying man. The next day his eyes were bright with fever, and his breath came in a hoarse rattle. He had taken pneumonia, and was soon in delirium. Thinking back on it, I believe that period of semi-consciousness was the only happy time he knew during his captivity. Around him there seemed to gather all the people he had known in his boyhood on the farm in Kansas and in his school days. Babbling happily, sometimes laughing, he spoke to his mother and his father and to the priests he'd known in the seminary. Even in his delirium, his unbreakable spirit manifested itself in sallies of humor. Finally, he sank into a deep and quiet sleep, and when he awoke, he was completely rational. The crisis had passed. He was getting well. But the Chinese did not intend that he should live. He was sitting up, eating and cracking jokes when the guards came with a litter to take him to the hospital. We knew then that he was doomed, for the hospital was no hospital at all, but a death house so dreadful that I make no attempt to describe it here. In the room in which he was placed, men in extremis were left to die untended in filth and freezing cold until merciful death took them. The doctors protested violently against his being taken there, but the Chinese cursed them and forbade them to go along and care for him. The rest of us protested. All they answered was, "He goes, he goes." Father himself made no protest. He looked around the room at all of us standing there and smiled. He held in his hands the pyx in which long ago he had carried the Blessed Sacrament. "Tell them back home that I died a happy death," he said, and smiled again. As they loaded him onto the litter, he turned to Lieutenant Nardella, from whose missal he had read the services. He put the little book in Nardella's hand. "You know the prayers, Ralph," he said. "Keep holding the services. Don't let them make you stop." He turned to another officer who, before his capture, had been having trouble at home. "When you get back to Jersey, you get that marriage straightened out," he told him, "or I'll come down from heaven and kick you in the tail." And then he turned to me. "Don't take it hard, Mike," he said. "I'm going where I've always wanted to go. And when I get up there, I'll say a prayer for all of you." I stood there crying, unashamed, as they took him down the road with the pyx still shining in his hand. A few days later, he was dead. Not long afterward, the little daughter of the Chinese camp commander walked past the compound gate. She was tossing and catching something that glittered in the sun. It was Father's little gold pyx. On the demands of the POWs, it was returned at Operation Big Switch. We brought it back to commemorate his deeds and the deeds of all who died at the hands of the communists. It is to be placed in a memorial in his hometown, a display case at Capon Mount Carmel High School. A year later, on the anniversary of his death, Ralph Nardella asked the communists for permission to hold a service in his memory. They refused. I was glad they did, For it told me that even though he was dead, his body lost forever in a mass grave, they were still afraid of him. They feared him because he was the symbol of something they knew they could not kill, the unconquerable spirit of a free man, owning final allegiance only to his God. And in that sense, I know he and the things that he believed in can never die. Father Capon was 35 years old when he died. Such a great blessing to hear that account from a fellow prisoner of war who knew Capon so well. So many things to be said about a man like that. One of those things is that it is astonishing that his canonization has not moved forward with greater speed. If you compare Father Capon in this level of manly heroism that went on and on and on, unbelievable, unspeakable human horrors, and yet the Vatican sees fit to beatify a teenager who died in 2006, who was a computer nerd. Blessed Carlo Acutis, I'm sure, was a very fine boy and spread devotion to Eucharistic miracles. But it's the height of contrast to compare what Father Emil Kapaun did and endured for the sake of Christ and his church and on behalf of all the men, irrespective of faith or none at all. It strikes me as a little bit unbalanced. And I pray that the discovery of his body, not in the Yalu River, not in the mass grave, but in Hawaii, where it was evidently brought over. Before now, they didn't have the techniques through DNA as we do now. And now the chapter begins about where to have his final resting place. Will his remains be in Wichita, in Pilsen, where? I would invite you to read one book. There are several biographies, and they're all very worth it. They're all great. You can find out more about his life as well from the website that I'll provide in the link at patrickcoffin.media. Also include a link to the couple of homilies that he gave, so you can hear this man's voice when he gave these speeches or sermons on radio in Tokyo during World War II. This is the kind of man that Flannery O'Connor had in mind when she wrote, "A good man is hard to find." I hope his cause goes forward. I hope he's named a saint, which he would richly deserve, because we need models of manly self-sacrifice. As the man agreed, he was all priest and all man. When he's named venerable, which I'm sure will happen soon, if these are not virtues that are universally heroic and worthy of imitation, I don't know what that means anymore. So, check out the links at patrickcoffin.media and learn more about Father Emil Kapaun. The one book I will recommend, I'll put a link in the show notes as well, is The Miracle of Father Capon by two Kansas reporters, Roy Wenzel and Travis Hying. It's an excellent account, not only a good summary of his life, but it goes into detail into the three miracles that I could do a 9-hour show just on each of those miracles that are on the desk of the Congregation for the Causes of Saints. There's really stunning, unusual, powerful miracles wrought by this great man, servant of God, Father Emil Kapaun. Father Capon, pray for us. We need it. This is the Patrick Coffin Show. Be a saint. What else is there?
Hey, this is Patrick Coffin. If you like what you see and hear and you want to see and hear more, consider joining Coffin Nation as a full member. Just click right here and find out more about what that means. Nipsey, my fedora. That's Coffin Nation, the world's largest online community of culture builders. Click right here. See you on the inside.